Good Maharaj.
Thank you.
कोई जाति देख रहे हैं?
शांत हीटर
हाँ।
ठीक है हीटर हुआ चाहिए ठीक है
Welcome to our question and answer session. Before we begin, just a quick announcement. When the microphone is passed to you, after you're done saying your question, please turn it off so there's no background noise. Also, this center is funded by volunteers like you, so please donate if you're able.
Thank you. Welcome to our evening Q&A. So any lingering questions, new questions, questions from the talk I gave yesterday or the class we had this morning, or any other questions you might have, please feel free.
One person per question.
One question per person. And then if we have time, we'll go back.
Hello, Swami.
Hi. Is the mic working?
Put it on.
Let's just keep it on. Yeah.
Swami, Friday and yesterday, this morning, we talked a little bit about renunciation. And then this morning, you made a comment and you said, enjoy the world through renunciation. So practically speaking, because renunciation has one meaning, right?
Yeah.
But then how do we enjoy the world through renunciation?
Yeah. If I understand your question correctly, there seems to be a kind of contradiction or kind of paradox involved.
Right.
Yeah. So it depends on how you understand renunciation. Traditionally, the terms pravritti and nivritti meant, respectively, enjoying the world, that would be pravritti, and renouncing the world, nivritti. Monks renounce the world, householders enjoy the world. This is a kind of standard. Swami Vivekananda, he gives new definitions, a new twist to the terms pravritti and nivritti in a really interesting way. He says that, roughly, pravritti is, because he's going back to the etymological root, this vrit means revolving. And so he says pravritti is any action revolving towards the ego, towards selfishness, toward the I and the mind. Anything that makes you more selfish, anything that makes you more self-centered is pravritti. And anything that helps you revolve away from the me and mine, revolve away from egoism, selfishness, that's nivritti. And with these redefinitions of the terms nivritti and pravritti and nivritti, then there's a nice way to resolve this apparent paradox between renunciation and enjoyment. The idea is you can enjoy this world as God if you renounce egoism and selfishness. It's not about actually renouncing anything external, it's about internal renunciation of worldly desires, worldly attachments, which are the support of ego. Take the ego out of the equation and you can truly enjoy the world. Mm-hmm.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
Swamiji, my name is Gitanjali.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you a little question. I had it came to my mind after I lectured this morning.
Words of the
Words
Master.
of the Master. You recognize this book, right, Maharaj?
Yeah, it's an unreliable translation, to be honest.
Yes,
But yeah,
and that is the thing.
of Brahmanandaji's compilation of Sri
Yes,
Ramakrishna's teachings.
yes,
Sri
the
Ramakrishna Upadesh is the
The
original.
translation isn't great, but there is on point number 3 in this book, a certain person asked Sri Ramakrishna, kindly instruct me in one word so that I may be illumined.
Yeah.
To which he replied, meaning Sri Ramakrishna, he says the absolute is the only reality. The universe is unreal. Realize this, and basically he says, basically that's what he said. So basically he's here himself saying the absolute is Brahman is Satya, and the universe is unreal. The Jagat is Mithya. So this is part one of my question, and the second.
But what's the question?
So the question was that when you said in the morning that Brahma Satya, Jagat Satya, so Sri Ramakrishna himself is saying here that Jagat is Mithya. Here. Another example that I remembered about was in the Gospel, where he says that if I knew the world to be real, I would cover Kamar Pukur with gold. So can you reconcile these two thoughts of the Master with what you were talking about in the morning?
Okay, so these are very good questions. Yeah, so coming back to kind of what I was talking about this morning. So because my talk was all about Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, which were Turiyanji's last words. And on my interpretation, he is faithfully expounding Sri Ramakrishna's views. And you're saying, but there are certain places where Sri Ramakrishna seems to be saying the opposite, right? So the first example you gave is from Sri Sri Ramakrishna Upadesh, compiled by Swami Brahmanandaji. And we monks jokingly say, and edited by Sri Ramakrishna, because he was the spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna, and he had this kind of direct line of communication with him. And he himself said that there were times when I was compiling the teachings when Sri Ramakrishna would tell me, no, I didn't say that, I said this. So we can take it as authentic. The original Bangla, not words of the master,
No, that's why I
unfortunately.
said,
Yeah, the translation is unfortunate, to be honest. But anyway, but the original Bengali of the teaching that you quote is, so one person comes to Sri Ramakrishna and says, tell me in one statement what will lead me to the highest. And Sri Ramakrishna says in Bangla, Brahma Shattu Jagat Mithya. So that's right. I mean, so that's faithful enough, that translation that you gave in that regard. Brahman alone is true. Everything else is mithya, unreal. And you're saying, well, how do you reconcile that with what I said this morning? It's a very good question. One big problem with Brahmanandaji's compilation is that unlike M's Kathamrita, it gives absolutely no context. They're just these kind of teachings. We have no idea who's asking the question. We don't know on what day the question was asked. We don't know what the kind of surrounding questions or discussion was. So all those things are very, very important clues as to context, to be able to contextualize the teachings. We have none of it. All of these teachings are just numbered and completely stripped of their context. Whereas, just to give you an example, something I already brought up this morning, but I'm going to say it again because it's just useful to kind of contrast the rigor of M's work with Brahmanandaji's, which I don't want to say is unrigorous. It's just, it's different. I mean, and so we have to understand its limitations. This morning I talked about an incident recorded in the Kathamrita when Mohima Chakraborty, who was a follower of Shankara, so we know all that because we have the background about Mohima. We know who's asking the question. He asks, don't bhaktas also need to attain nirvana in the end? Don't they all have to ultimately become sugar? Isn't eating sugar an intermediate stage, like Krama Mukti that you brought up this morning? And then in that context, to that person, Sri Ramakrishna is saying no. Because there's such a thing as Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta, right? So likewise, the missing information that would give us crucial context for understanding that teaching would be who is asking the question, what prompted the asking of the question, who else was present in the room. I mean, these kinds of things. Was it a private conversation? Who was it? Why is that relevant? Well, because Sri Ramakrishna could read our hearts directly. He could see right into, and what he did was he would tailor his teachings to the individual spiritual aspirant. This was his genius, his spiritual genius. We all know that about Sri Ramakrishna. So now, imagine that the person was a follower of Shankara. Do you think if Sri Ramakrishna said, worship Krishna, that would have had any effect on that person? No. Or giving him a big lecture about devotion and all that, Bhaja Govindam? No. So, but again, it's speculative because we don't know. We don't have the context, that crucial context. So I imagine one way to simply reconcile all that I talked about this morning, what Turiyanji has said, Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, with that kind of statement is, I think it's plausible to assume that Sri Ramakrishna recognized that person asking the question had Shankarite leanings, and therefore he gave to him a very succinct Shankarite teaching. The most succinct one there is, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Now, that's part of the answer. But then the fuller answer to that question is, there's always a great danger in what's called cherry picking. Taking one teaching and saying, well, how do you recognize this? So the thing is, we have to take everything together. We have to take all 1,000 pages of the Kathamrita and everything he says there. And then we have to somehow try to reconcile it with statements we find elsewhere. Do you see what I mean? So if we take that one isolated statement to be authoritative, then we're stuck trying to explain the million statements in the gospel when he's contrasting the Jnani's outlook, which is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, with the Vijnani's outlook, which is Brahma Satyam Jagat. So it's not that everything is simple if we accept that as authoritative. A rigorous student of the Kathamrita and of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings cannot cherry pick, should not cherry pick, but should try to be comprehensive. And so that's why, from my standpoint, I see that the general thrust of 99% of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings is going in one direction, the Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam direction. There is this 1%. There is the Holy Mother saying Thakur Advaita, which apparently seems to be saying that He might have been a follower of Shankara. Or Sri Ramakrishna saying, Advaita Anshale Veda Jaki Chukara, tie the knowledge of non-duality in your loincloth and do whatever you wish. Or this kind of isolated statement that you find in Brahmanandaji's compilation. So then what I obviously try to do is try to reconcile the 1% with the 99%, because I think clearly that the overwhelming kind of thrust of what he's saying is going in the Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam direction. And the way to do that would be to say, as Turiyanji does, when Sri Ramakrishna says, tie the cloth of non-duality in your loincloth, that Advaita is Brahma Shakti Advaita. So Vijnana Vedanta rather than Shankara's. That kind of statement you quote in Raja Maharaj's compilation, you can say, well, the person probably had Shankara leaning. Do you see what I'm saying? So you might say, well, it seems like you're just ad hoc kind of, but what I'm trying to do is be comprehensive.
But what about
Yeah.
the other statement he said?
Yeah,
about-
Mike.
No, one question.
No, this is-
Well, that's okay. Let it fall. See, the thing is, it's a 1 hour, and I don't think everybody here is dying to ask questions. So maybe I'm wrong about that.
This is the same
Yeah.
question I asked, Uncle. This is not a second question.
Yeah.
This
No,
is
that's
part
okay.
two of it
Let's have.
question.
Otherwise, it becomes artificial. So let's have a discussion properly. Yeah.
So what about the second part, which is what
Yeah.
confused me?
Yeah.
Because then he said that if I knew the world to be real.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, are you Bengali?
Yes.
So what's the original Bangla there?
আমি ঠিক জানি না।
ওটা যদি জানতাম যে কি
জগৎ সত্য না জগৎ
সত্য
মিথ্যা।
সত্য কি বলেছে
জগৎ মিথ্যা,
হ্যাঁ।
তাহলে
না সত্য হবে সত্য
না জগৎ মিথ্যা, তাহলে
So the thing is, okay, well, hold on. In the meantime, when other people ask questions, go run and find the Leela person, go and tell me. I want to know what the original Bangla is, because the thing is, in the gospel, for instance, there are many places where Nikhilanji will translate real and unreal for words like nitya and anitya, which means permanent and impermanent. And so that's why I think it's very important to go back to the original Bangla. And because I'm a scholar, I want to know what the original words are. No, this is Leela Prasanga. I think this statement is not in the gospel. It's found in the Leela Prasanga. I doubt it. It's almost certainly in the Leela Prasanga. So you have to check Sharadananji's biography of Sri Ramakrishna and then find the original Bangla. So then we can talk about because we have to look at the exact words. One thing I find again and again in the gospel, really Kathamrita, is that Nikhilanji is kind of sort of veering Sri Ramakrishna closer to Shankara by translating words like permanent and impermanent as real and unreal in many places. And that's just a mistranslation as far as I can tell. And so that's why I want to know what the original word is. So I think in general, I mean, again, this whole, if we take the comprehensive approach, look at everything Sri Ramakrishna says in the gospel and in the Leela Prasanga and elsewhere, what I find is what he means by real and unreal is permanent and impermanent. If I thought that this world is permanent, then I would, and then that's a simple way of explaining it. Because that's consistent with many statements in the Kathamrita, in the original Bangla, but which is occluded by Nikhilanji's translation. Oh, but the second part of your question. Well, that is the second part of your question. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the gold plate, yeah. Okay, other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Hello, Maharaj. My name is Kanat. So my question, it has to do with an assertion that I've seen several times on online forums where people assert that there's no difference between solipsism and Advaita, which I intuitively, I know that's not true, so it doesn't trouble me. But when I try to find a logical response to that, I seem to come up empty. I was wondering,
I see.
what would you say would be a logical refutation of that assertion?
Okay. First of all, by Advaita, I think you mean classical Advaita Vedanta. Is that right? Yeah. So let's be clear, because I just talked about a different kind of Advaita this morning. Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. Okay, now we're talking about Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Now, the question is an interesting one. You say that some people equate classical Advaita Vedanta with solipsism. And you don't like that equation, but you don't have a good sort of good evidence for refuting it. Okay, so the thing is, it's a little bit more complicated than that, okay? Because the tradition of Advaita, of classical Advaita Vedanta itself is not monolithic. Especially post-Shankara, even pre-Shankara, you have Gaudapada, which is maybe not quite the same thing as Shankara, and I'll just flag an example. In Mandvika Karika, Gaudapada seems to put the waking state and the dream state on an equal ontological footing. Yatha swapne dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha tatha jagrat dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha. Just as the mind spins out a world in the dream state, just so the mind spins out, projects a world in the waking state. No difference whatsoever. Shankara refutes that position, not by naming Gaudapada, but in the form of a refutation of Yogacara Buddhism in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, where he says that Yogacara Buddhists are wrong in putting the waking state and the dream state on an equal ontological footing. In fact, the waking state has a greater degree of reality than the dream state, even though when you attain knowledge of Brahman, both states are sublated, like chopping off, so both go at one stroke. But nonetheless, so long as we haven't realized Brahman, we have to accept the greater degree of reality of the waking state. That's an example of kind of distinctions even between Shankara and Gaudapada. Now it gets even more diverse, internally diverse, post-Shankara. And there are two major sub-schools within post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta. One is called Srishti Drishtivada. The other is called Drishti Srishtivada. Okay, so this is a lot of Sanskrit with people mumbo jumbo, and people might be confused now. Srishti Drishti. Srishti means creation. Drishti means seeing, perception. Vada means doctrine. So Srishti Drishti Vada means the doctrine that creation precedes perception. The famous question in Western philosophy: if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to perceive it, does it really fall? So Srishti Drishti Vadans within the fold of Advaita Vedanta will say, yes, there is creation apart from our perception of it, so long as we haven't realized Brahman. There's always that caveat at the end, because when we realize Brahman, we realize the snake never existed. There's only rope, right? But we're talking about now the level of empirical reality, Vyavaharika Satta. Okay, now, Drishti Srishti Vada. It's just a reversal of Srishti Drishti. So Drishti comes first. Perception precedes creation, which means there is no creation apart from perception. George Berkeley, the great Scottish philosopher, has this famous Latin formula, esse est percipi, which means the same thing. To be is to be perceived. And that is a kind of solipsism, right? So now, there is a sub-school of post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta which is solipsistic. And there are texts. There's a whole book dedicated to defending Drishti Srishtivada, kind of Advaitic solipsism, namely Prakashananda's Siddhanta Muktavali, Vedanta Siddhanta Muktavali. And even as mainstream post-Shankara Advaitin as Madhusudana Saraswati, who's widely considered to be one of the greatest post-Shankara Advaitins, he wrote a masterpiece called Advaita Siddhi and all these things. He seems to think that he has a smaller book called Siddhanta Bindu, where he discusses Srishti Drishtivada and Drishti Srishtivada and favors the latter. And says that Drishti Srishtivada, this solipsistic kind of Advaita, is a higher teaching for more advanced Advaitic practitioners, because it's too much to take for even most Advaitins. This is even just within other, forget about Bhaktas, they're beyond the pale. But even among Advaitins, there are hierarchies.
But does Drishti Srishtivada have to be solipsistic?
That's by definition, it's solipsistic.
But if you look at it from the perspective of...
By the way, let me, yeah, and then you can follow up. But
yes.
See, because the way that Madhusudana Saraswati explains it, Prakashananda explains Drishti Srishti, it's bound up with the doctrine of what's called Eka Jiva Vada. There's only one Jiva. It's not that there are 20 Jivas in this room. There's only one. I am the one Jiva and I'm dreaming all of you. That's solipsism. So the two doctrines go hand in hand. Drishti Srishti Vada entails Eka Jiva Vada. And then the two together really do seem to entail a solipsism. But now go ahead.
I guess I was going to say that even with Drishti Srishtivada, where there's what's the term Eka?
What?
Eka Jiva Vada, right?
Yeah. The one Jiva. Eka
One
just
jiva.
means one, Jiva
one,
means Jiva.
right.
Yeah.
Even in that context, though, the one Jiva, even though I, as personal cannot am perceiving that, it is really beyond my personalness. It encompasses not only this person, but every other person.
We don't know.
Right.
And that's an interesting idea. I mean, the thing is, it's complicated. Appaya Dikshita, he has a book in which he talks about a version of Drishti Srishtivada within Advaita Vedanta, which holds that who is the one soul? God. So that's another view, is that God is dreaming all of us. So we're stuck in God's dream. which is interesting. But that's not the only view. There are actually subdivisions within this Drishti Srishti school of Advaita. So it's complicated. I mean, actually, the question you're asking is really about, it involves sort of, you would have to go into textual exegesis and look at the different post-Shankara Advaitins and the way that they explain Drishti Srishti, and they don't all agree on these issues. Some of them, I think, are full-blown solipsists. Others aren't. And maybe and the Appaya Dikshita view of this Drishti Srishti where the one soul is Ishvara, is that more along the lines of what you were thinking of, or I mean,
Can you clarify that?
yeah, it's just that God is the dreamer, God is the one soul,
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
yeah, and we're figments of God's imagination.
Yes.
And Berkeley actually kind of held that view. Berkeley in the West.
May I ask, what is your personal?
I don't accept classical Advaita Vedanta. I accept Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. That's my personal. I hope that was clear this morning. So all of that's kind of merely scholastic to me. I'm certainly not a solipsist. Yeah, the world is real. So then, how can I be a solipsist? Okay.
Maybe I'll ask the question.
Yeah, please.
I've been talking with one of my close friends who is equally interested in some of the subjects we have been talking about. The question, I'm going to change the direction of Aurobindo and his mystical reunion with Ramakrishna and also Vivekananda in the Alipur jail that we have sort of elucidated in the book. You know,
Elucidated in the book, yeah.
right. Yeah, how realistic you think it is, and do you really believe that this is actual event, or is it something that he perceived as a mystical experience?
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, but just to clarify first, Sri Aurobindo did have mystical communications both with Sri Ramakrishna and with Swami Vivekananda, or at least claimed to have, because that's the question. It's more about did he really or not is the question. But before I get there, I just want to clarify something. Okay, but he only had mystical communications. He only claimed to have had mystical communications with Swami Vivekananda in Alipur jail, not Sri Ramakrishna. He claimed to have had mystical communications with Sri Ramakrishna on 3 separate occasions apart from Alipur jail. Okay, I think maybe at least once before going to jail and once after, something like that. I don't remember the exact chronology, but none of those 3 communications with Sri Ramakrishna were in the Alipur jail. Only Swami Vivekananda. So let me distinguish these things. First of all, what were his mystical communications with Sri Ramakrishna? He claimed, and he wrote these in his journal, in his diary, that I don't think he quoted Sri Ramakrishna's all 3 of them, but he quoted 2 of them at least. One of them, he says that Sri Ramakrishna came to him, obviously in a vision or something. I mean, not necessarily a vision, but came to him. He was sure it was Sri Ramakrishna. And they were both Bengalis, so they spoke in Bangla. And so Sri Ramakrishna tells Sri Aurobindo, Aurobindo, mundir koro. Aurobindo, start your own ashrama. Start your own ashrama or your own temple. So then Aurobindo ashrama started. Another one is more kind of cryptic and philosophical and mystical, where he quoted Sri Ramakrishna as telling him a very sort of, as I said, cryptic teaching about like a snake devouring its own tail, and pravritti and nivritti, kind of somehow the inseparability of pravritti and it's very complicated, almost as difficult to grasp as when Swamiji had the vision of microcosm and macrocosm in Almora. So that can be interpreted in many ways, but it's very interesting. And there's a third time, I'm not sure that he actually quoted the third, what exactly Sri Ramakrishna communicated to him. But after having all those communications, and having studied carefully the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo himself said to a disciple early on, this is about 1908 or 9, said, remember also that we derive from Ramakrishna, these exact words. It was Ramakrishna who personally came and first turned me to this yoga. Such strong statements. And in another place, in an essay in the Karma Yogan, I think published 1909, he says Sri Ramakrishna was the last and greatest of all of the incarnations. Because whereas previous incarnations had realized God and manifested God in certain limited forms or aspects, Sri Ramakrishna realized God in as an illimitable unity of a sum of an illimitable variety, something like that. And so he had tremendous reverence for Sri Ramakrishna, and he claimed to have mystically communicated with him 3 times. Now, with regard to the Alipur jail, he claimed that Swami Vivekananda had come to him for a fortnight. So every day for 2 weeks roughly. And what did Swami Vivekananda teach him? He taught him, this is what Sri Aurobindo said later when disciples asked him about exactly what transpired, what Vivekananda taught him. He said, he taught me about the kind of meditative and experiential stages leading to supermind. Not about the supermind itself, but the stages sort of like paving the way for supermind, which is like the pinnacle of Sri Aurobindo's spiritual philosophy. And then one of his disciples asks, and this is recorded, I think, in Evening Talks, a book, in Conversations with Sri Aurobindo. Somebody asked, so you had visions of Swami Vivekananda coming into your jail cell? He said, no, they weren't visions. If they were visions, I could have doubted them. But these were, I'm 100% sure that Swami Vivekananda himself came. And so they weren't visions, they were even stronger than that. He himself says that. So do I believe his claims about mystical communications with Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda? Yes. Now, I mean, can I prove it to you? No. Everything depends. It depends on whether you think that the mystic making these claims is credible or not. That's what it comes down to. And that's an individual thing. It depends on how seriously you take Sri Aurobindo as a mystic and as a yogi. I happen to think that I take him very seriously as a mystic and a yogi. Other people will dismiss him. And so obviously they're not going to give as much credence to these kinds of claims. And so I do, because as I give credence to Sri Ramakrishna and to Swami Vivekananda and to many other great saints like Jesus and Papa Ram Das and so many others, Ramana Maharshi. And why do I think they're credible? Well, because I look at their life. I think that's the ultimate test. Do they walk the walk, or do they just talk the talk? And in that regard, I don't see blemishes in a life in the way that you do find in some other people who will go unnamed.
Well, that leads to a follow-up question.
Yeah.
How does one know the legitimacy or the validity of so-called experience? How do I know that that is a fact and the other one is not? Or it's just a made-up story?
Yeah. Are you talking about your own or about other people's?
Anyone can claim that I had a mystical experience of seeing God.
Yeah.
How do I know that that is a fact?
I know, but I still want clarity on your question. Are you asking whether, let's say, I'm the one claiming to have a mystical experience. How do I know that my experience is real, or how do you know that my experience is real? What do you ask? Okay, we have to separate these two. I'm a philosopher, so we don't want to mix these things together. Otherwise, we make khichdi. And khichdi is tasty. I had one at lunch, but let's not do that right now. Okay, so first question. Let's pretend I'm a mystic, and I'm claiming to have had a spirit. I think I have had a spiritual experience, okay? Let's say of God. And the question is, how can I be sure, right? So now, I actually discussed this at length in chapter 6 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. So you can read that and do your homework. But I'll give you a little summary of kind of what I say there. Okay, so what's interesting is that mystics themselves have distinguished different kinds of mystical experiences that they claim to have had. Some of which they claim are self-authenticating, and others they claim are not. This is important. What does self-authenticating mean? It means, if I have a spiritual experience which is self-authenticating, it means that by dint of having that experience, there's no room for doubt. I can't doubt it. Because I know that experience is true, and the experience itself leaves no room for doubt. Any sense experience always leaves room for doubt. Why? As Descartes pointed out, because this whole thing could be a dream. Or an evil demon could be conjuring up the whole thing. Or we could be in the Matrix. There are a million possibilities that we can't possibly rule out. We can't. But mystics who claim to have had self-authenticating spiritual experiences say that, like, remember when Swamiji first came to Sri Ramakrishna and said, have you seen God? What does he say? Yes, I've seen God, but I see him and perceive him more intimately, more strongly than even I talk to God more intimately and more directly than I'm talking to you now, which means it has a greater certainty than even sense perceptions. Okay, so now that's a part of the answer, because now, so for instance, Sri Ramakrishna himself distinguished different kinds of mystical experience that he had. right? There's an occasion when he's talking about, he claims to have had an experience of Kali. What happens? As usual, Naren is always critically questioning and doubting. And so but one thing that's great about Naren is that he doesn't talk behind his back. He tells him directly to his face. So he says, that's a hallucination. I just studied this stuff about megalomania, and I think this is a symptom of megalomania. Okay. So Sri Ramakrishna, because he's like a child, he starts worrying about, oh my goodness, Naren is such a pure soul. Narayana himself is telling me that my vision of Kali is a hallucination. So what does he do? He goes to Mother. Not his mother, Divine Mother. And he prays. And he says, this is what Naren is telling me, oh Mother. What do I do? How do I know that my visions of you are real? What does she do? She then gives him an assurance by giving him a second mystical experience, which is self-authenticating, which guarantees to him that the previous visions of her were also real. You see, and this is not just true of Sri Ramakrishna. Saint Teresa of Avila, a great female Catholic mystic, I talk about her in chapter 6 of Infinite Paths as well, because she has a wonderful autobiography where she also distinguishes certain spiritual experiences of God that she had, which were not self-authenticating, where she genuinely had doubts. Maybe this experience I had, which is so overwhelmingly powerful to me, is conjured up by Satan, because they have a Satan idea in Christianity, right? Maybe Satan is the one who's making me think to make me puff up with pride. But in fact, it's not a real experience. Then she says, but there are other experiences I've had which are not open to doubt. They leave no room for doubt. Those are self-authenticating. And she says, because those are experiences which carry their truth within the experience itself. So just by having the experience, you can't possibly doubt it. And it's not just can't possibly doubt it because you're subjectively certain, but that there's an objective certainty to it as well. And then there's a philosophical question about whether a self-authenticating spiritual experience is even possible. And then I defend the possibility of self-authenticating spiritual experiences in chapter 6, and it gets very technical and complicated, and so I'll have to stop there. Yeah.
And what about the second half of that question?
What was the second half of your question? Oh, thank you. Yeah. Second half is, why should I believe that somebody else, a so-called mystic, like an Aurobindo or Ramakrishna, we remember from, was it today's class or yesterday? Now I'm getting confused. I think it was this morning. Shantinath, Sadhu Shantinath, at the end of his autobiography, he starts doubting every single so-called mystic's spiritual experiences, including Sri Ramakrishna's, and says they're all hallucinations. So this is somebody who just suddenly decides, I'm not going to believe any of them. Okay, so that's the second question, is why should we, or on what grounds should we accept the testimony of so-called mystics, right? And I already kind of gave an answer, I think, which is, that's up to, you have to decide how credible that testifier is, that mystic is. What are the criteria for credibility? Look at their life. Look at their spiritual practices. Look at the life that they're leading. Are they leading pure lives, ethical lives? Do you detect ego in them? I mean, one thing that's a kind of a clear giveaway, and I'm not naming names, but this is very funny because since coming back to the West, it's every day somebody tells me about their spiritual experiences almost, especially in Q&As like this. They raise their hand, and instead of asking a question, they brag about their spiritual experiences in front of a group of people, and it's weird. And then I always wonder, like, what do you get out of telling a room full of strangers about your so-called spiritual experiences? That person loses credibility in my eyes, to be honest. And I'm not saying that it's impossible that they had spiritual experiences, but it raises doubts in my mind. Because if you really had something so precious, would you really throw pearls before swine? That's the question. So that's just an example of kind of times when I question people's credibility when they talk about their spiritual experiences. I'm not saying that I'm 100% sure. Nobody can be 100% sure whether a mystic has had or not had a genuine spiritual experience. But it raises doubts in my mind. And if there's somebody else whom I know intimately to be a pure, unselfish soul, who comes and tells me privately in a very humble way and in a particular context, not in a kind of bragging way, then I'm happy to give the benefit of the doubt to that kind of person. And I'm not going to name names of sadhus, but there are senior sadhus that I've met that have suggested this. Yeah.
Maharaj,
an incident took place in the life of Ramana Maharshi. Similar things. Somebody was explaining to him, his own devoted person, this almost like a householder disciple. And he was explaining the vision he had and how he saw the illumination around Ramana Maharshi and all that. Ramana Maharshi heard everything. I said, you are describing something perceived by your mind. That means it is unreal. Should we take that as a criteria? Whatever is perceived by the mind and described is unreal.
Okay, that's interesting. So now the thing is, we have to again bring in this question of framework here. Ramana Maharshi was a classical Advaita Vedanta, a follower of Shankara. So the thing is, he's saying that from the lofty heights of classical Advaita Vedanta. From that standpoint, all spiritual experiences themselves are unreal, in the same way that this table is unreal. Why? Because a spiritual experience entails a subject and an object. There's a person who's having a mystical experience, unreal. I don't accept that position, as I said to somebody else who's asking a question about. But he's speaking as a classical Advaita Vedanta and telling that person. So this reminds me of Ashtavakra Samhita. Swami Vivekananda quotes it in Shami Shishu Shangvad, this Conversations with Sharat Chandra Chakraborty, where Sharat Chandra Chakraborty keeps talking about Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And Swamiji looks at him and says, you call yourself roughly, I'm paraphrasing, you call yourself a follower of Shankara and classical Advaita Vedanta? What does Ashtavakra Samhita say? Ayameva hite bandhaha samadhim anuttishtasi. This alone is your bondage, that you remain in the state of samadhi. It's a very interesting state, but in a strict Advaita, classical Advaitic sense, that's true. Samadhi itself is unreal. So actually, this again is a complicated, this is going back to this kind of issue of kind of sub-schools within Advaita, the fact that it's not monolithic. In post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta, there are multiple strains or streams, okay? One strain, which is very mainstream, insists on the importance of Nirvikalpa Samadhi for the attainment of Brahma Jnana, to the point where there's almost a kind of direct equation of Nirvikalpa Samadhi with knowledge of non-dual Brahman. Okay? If you ask me what text I'm thinking of Vedanta Sara, some of the core texts in post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta. Sabarpanaji talks about a lot. Vedanta Sara, Jivana Mukti Viveka, and many others. They all place Viveka Chudamani. They all insist on the extreme importance of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. What about Totapuri? Some of you have studied Lalila Prashango, Gospel. What was his view? Did he place importance on Nirvikalpa Samadhi? Absolutely, because he belonged to that mainstream post-Shankara tradition. But there's another strain of Advaita Vedanta. The most recent exponent of it that I'm aware of is the more contemporary Dayananda Saraswati, who left his body a few years ago. Not the Arya Samaj Dayananda, who was a contemporary of Sri Ramakrishna, but somebody, Ashavidya Gurukula. He belonged to this other school of Advaita, post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta, which believes that all spiritual experiences are they're unimportant. And they have nothing to do with Brahma Jnana. In fact, in an interview with Dayananda Saraswati, somebody asked about Ramana Maharshi's many experiences of Samadhi. And he says, any householder can have those experiences. He kind of poo-poos it and says, I'm not impressed. He says, Samadhi is not the goal of Advaita Vedanta. And now let me ask you a more interesting question, which really touches the heart of our tradition. When Sri Ramakrishna talks about classical Advaita Vedanta, when he talks about attaining Brahma Jnana, does he place importance on Nirvikalpa Samadhi? Yes or no? Just basing it on the gospel.
What is the question again?
The question is, how much importance does Sri Ramakrishna give to the attainment of Nirvikalpa Samadhi in the attainment of Brahma Jnana? In order to attain Brahma Jnana, is Nirvikalpa Samadhi necessary?
He says it's a step in the process. Then you go to Vijnana.
Let's bracket Vijnana, because remember, he's contrasting let's just restrict ourselves to his description of Jnana. How do you attain Brahma Jnana in the classical Advaitic sense, according to Sri Ramakrishna? What do you guys think? You guys have studied the Kathamrita or the Gospel, some translation, right? Does he talk much about Nirvikalpa Samadhi? He-
Aman,
Huh?
the
Hold on,
problem-
but please answer the question. Are you gonna? Yeah,
The only time he talked about
Yeah,
it
yeah.
to his disciples.
Yeah.
If he can do some 1/18th or part of what he did as
Okay,
sadhana.
well, I'm not sure that that's the context of Samadhi. My answer is the opposite of Gitanjali, actually. I think that his teachings about classical Advaita are full of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, statements about Nirvikalpa Samadhi. When he talks about the Nunir Putul, the salt all melting in the ocean, when he talks about his own experiences of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, again and again he talks about Nirvikalpa Samadhi as if it's tantamount to Brahmagyana. I don't even see his view as you have to attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi and then you have Brahmagyana. He says that attaining Nirvikalpa Samadhi is attaining Brahmagyana. Maybe you can argue with me. You can say, I don't think that's true, but I want to see the textual evidence. When I read Kathamrita, and now I don't know how many times I've read it, I see, and his view is just basically verbatim repeating Totapuri's view, which is itself a mainstream view within post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta, Vedanta Sara and many other texts. Swami Vivekananda also strongly emphasizes Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but in this instance, when he's talking to Sharat Chandra Chakraborty, because of the context and because of maybe his understanding of Sharat Chandra Chakraborty's temperament, he's reminding him that even all these spiritual experiences and samadhis you're talking about are all still within the realm of Maya, which is also strictly true from the Advaitic standpoint. But then Brahmagyana itself is within the realm of Maya. That's the other thing we have to add. That's also unreal. Jnana involves a triputi, the triad. Knower, object of knowledge, and knowledge. Yeah, and the knowledge itself. That's the triputi, triangle. That's already not non-duality, right? So if you want to throw samadhi into the fire of Maya, then you also have to throw Brahmagyan into the fire of Maya. Anyway, so I think I hope that's an answer to whoever asked that question. Oh, so coming back, this Ramana Maharshi question. That was the thing. So Ramana Maharshi, I think was saying something along the lines of the Ashtavakra Samhita kind of approach, which is that all of your so-called spiritual experiences, they could be genuine from the standpoint of empirical reality, Vyavaharika Satta. But from the ultimate standpoint, none of these have any importance because none of it's real. It's all that snake. And there's no snake. There never was a snake. There's just Brahman. Brahman doesn't have spiritual experiences. We do. Individuals do, right? Who's in Samadhi? Brahman's not in Samadhi. That's classical Advaita Vedanta.
Does this correlate to the fact, many times Thakur explained it, no one can describe that state, what Brahman is in that state. Nobody can describe it. And he also says once you are trying to say something,
Yeah.
My mother comes and blocks my
She's
mouth.
holding my tongue. Yeah, something like that. Maybe. I mean, many spiritual experiences are very difficult. Can you turn off the mic? Yeah. Many spiritual experiences are difficult to explain, obviously. That's the nature of mystical experiences. But he says that some in particular are impossible to explain in words. So one of them, I think, is Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He tried, and the example he used is the saltol melting in the ocean. That's the best that he can do. That is very kind of illustrative. But language has its limitations. But I think that he says it also in the context of Abar Kotoki. Remember this morning I talked about his teaching, Tini Nirakar Shakar Abar Kotoki. That one supreme reality is Nirakara, which means formless, and Nirguna. So that's the classical Advaitic Brahman. It's also Sakara, all the different forms of the personal God. And then he adds Abar Kotoki. The Abar Kotoki, I think Nikalanji faithfully translates as much more besides. That also is inexplicable. You can't explain that in words. How can you explain what God is beyond? It's almost like if God is Nirakara and Sakara, what's left? Doesn't that exhaust the possibilities? What is there? But then he adds, no, because that's the limitations of language. God is also beyond form and formlessness. But how in the world do you explain that in words? You can only experience it directly. So I want to say that Avang Manasa Gocharam aspect, right? That some spiritual experiences are beyond mind and beyond words, language, applies not only to the state of Advaitic Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but also to the experience of God as much more besides. Yeah,
Can we say that?
Mike, please.
Can we say that all this becomes so difficult explaining God who has experienced Nibbana Samadhi? It is like you're having a glimpse, you appear to have a glimpse of infinity. So when somebody asks you, how did you see, what is infinity? See, we have no idea that we are such a small, tiny particle compared to the infinity. We are just part of this solar system. Solar system is a part of galaxy. Galaxy is universe. So it is in one way we are practically nothing. I mean, we don't exist. So we are trying to experience something which cannot be experienced. And then somebody is asking when we come down to the normal state that can you explain it? Of course, language is a very abstraction of expression, which is not perfect at all in no way. Nobody can say any language, whether it is any language of this world, can express say what we are thinking. If somebody says, it's an approximation. That is the best we can get. That is one question. The other question.
Okay, hold on. Let's pause there because otherwise I'll get confused. Okay, so first of all, I think that there's just a simpler explanation of why Nirvikalpa Samadhi cannot be explained in words. I mean, you gave a long explanation. My simpler one is this. In the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, there's no experiencer because there's no subject-object duality. So then how in the world are you supposed to explain what you experienced in a state in which there was no you, there was no I? Because the moment there's an I, there's no subject and there's no object in that state. That's the whole point of Sri Ramakrishna's salt doll analogy. So then you come back and suddenly your eye is restored and you're completely bewildered because, right? It's like the salt doll getting sort of like, pulled back out of the ocean. So just imagine the difficulty of explaining what the ocean itself is when you're not there. How can you explain a state in which you're not there? And right, so that I think is a simpler explanation of why the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi is so difficult to do. It's a literally non-dual state. So there's no experiencer in that state. So how can an experiencer describe that experience? So now, yes, please. Second part of your second question.
Second question.
Yeah.
I was told, and this I read somewhere, even Einstein said that what we experience in our life is nothing but an optical illusion. I mean, he clearly, distinctly said that it is nothing but optical illusion, which many other from our group of monks and our literature, Ramakrishna thing, they also say the same thing in many ways. The sarpa and the snake and the robes, that simile, that one, all these things go with the thing. Is it so? When people say it's confusing, I mean, for somebody like us, it's very confusing sometimes. What I'm seeing now, like Ashtabhakra, Raja, King Janaka. King Janaka saw a very, frightful dream, and then Ashtabhakra was going around the city or the town, and then he said, what has happened? Which is true? Is it my dream true, or my life? This one is true.
Yeah.
Then he said, both are unreal. Both are unreal.
Okay, but what's the question?
So the question is it true that both are unreal? If it is true, both are unreal, the question is, then it is optical illusion.
Did you come to my lecture this morning, the class? What's my answer?
I mean, we discussed a lot of things, but
I want you to think a little bit. Based on the class we had this morning, what do you think my answer to your question would be?
It is not. Like when you said the topic of your topic was
Brahma Satyam, Jagat Satyam.
Satyam. But the original text was, the title was Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya. When somebody was saying Jagat Mithya, the other like Shankara and all, Jagat Mithya, then Thakur Ramakrishna said that it is not true. I mean, he came with the concept that Jagat Mithya as well as everything else what we see is Satya. I mean, Brahma Satya and Jagat Satya. is the Brahma Satta remains same. Brahma Satta, of course, Brahma is Satta.
Well, there's a slight difference. I mean, my title was a little misleading. Actually, Sri Ramakrishna's view, Vijnana Vedanta would be Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. That is a difference. Because remember, Brahma Shakti Abhed, according to Sri Ramakrishna, which means, and whereas Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, according to classical Advaita, their Brahman means only Nirguna Brahman. They're not including personal God in that Brahman, whereas Sri Ramakrishna is. So strictly speaking, it should be Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. That's Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical formula. But then the answer is yes, not no. And Sri Ramakrishna himself says it explicitly in the Gospel, in the Kautamrita. He says, and he explicitly contrasts the classical Advaitans' understanding from the Vijnanis. And he says, classical Advaitans, Ganira bole. Gyanis dismiss all three states, waking, dream, and deep sleep. You know, he gives the example to Mohima. I'll tell you a story along the lines of your temperament. What is it? The farmer, the famous farmer story, who dreams he's a king, you know, a rich, wealthy king, and he has 5 sons. And then he wakes up from the dream and he's, oh my God, I just lost 5 wonderful sons when I was a king in my dream. So anyway, but the point is, then he says, that's what classical Advaitans do. They dismiss the reality of all 3 states. Then he says, Ami kintu sab avastha loy. I, however, accept all the states, waking, dream, and deep sleep, and turiya, because I see that they're all nothing but Divine Mother. Isn't that the answer to your question? He's directly contradicting classical Advaita Vedanta here and contrasting classical Advaita, which is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, with his own Vijnana Vedanta view, which is Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam.
Since no one has a question, I guess I'll ask it. I'm trying to understand. I mean, I know you had a discussion with Nishant Srivastavalingam about Kashmir Shaivism and
With whom? Sorry.
with Nishant. You know,
Oh,
yeah.
Nishant. Yeah. Nish the fish.
Nish the fish, right?
That's his moniker. Yeah.
The question is, besides the inclusive attitude of the Kashmir Shaivism, how is Vijnana Vedanta different from Kashmir Shaivism? And second part, where does Neo-Vedanta come in the picture besides the fact that there is a pejorative term related to Neo-Vedanta? But how Neo-Vedanta is different from Vijnana Vedanta that you are stating?
Okay. So the first one is, what really is the difference philosophically between Kashmiri Shaivism on the one hand and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta on the other? And what I emphasized in my discussion with Nishant was that Kashmiri Shaivism is at best inclusivistic with respect to non-Kashmiri Shaivite standpoints. And here, inclusivism, I mean in a technical sense, in the sense used by philosophers of religion and theologian, which means that there's a higher and a lower. And Kashmiri Shaivites will say, we are the highest standpoint, the Charam Siddhanta, Uttama Siddhanta. Other views aren't completely hopeless. They're not completely wrong, but they're stepping stones toward my highest viewpoint. Whereas Sri Ramakrishna doesn't say that. He doesn't. So, okay. But what you're asking is, are there any other salient differences? And the thing is, the answer I think is yes, but that means we have to go into the nitty gritty of kind of the metaphysical details and niceties of Kashmiri Shaivism. And then, like, for instance, this morning, somebody asked about the 24 cosmic principles referred to by Sri Ramakrishna. How many cosmic principles are there in Kashmiri Shaivism?
36.
12 more. Isn't that a difference? Yeah. And we can go on. I mean, there's a whole scheme of sadhanas. Sri Ramakrishna doesn't at least explicitly talk about Shaktipata and then all these different things. And then Anavamalas, and there are a million technical details in Kashmiri Shaivism. It's an extremely elaborate philosophical edifice. And do we really want to say that Sri Ramakrishna subscribes to all of it? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's plausible because we don't have evidence for it. So there are actually a lot of details where I think that he would differ from Kashmiri Shaivites.
It would be certainly nice for some point in time. I know that you are going to have some other discussion some point in time, but trying to delineate what are the key major differences between those two. And the fact,
you're giving me a lot more homework because then I have to really study Kashmiri Shaivism.
Yeah. I also asked the same question to Nishant as to why Ramakrishna never mentions Kashmir Shaivism.
Well, but there's a simple reason for that. You know what the answer is? Because Kashmir Shaivism was basically unknown at that time.
Agree.
Tantra was known.
So is it?
But Kashmiri Shaivism as a philosophical school grounded in Tantra was unknown until kind of early 20th century.
That was his answer.
Yeah.
But the question is, even without describing the name of Kashmir Shaivism, does Ramakrishna actually describe the concept of Kashmir Shaivism.
Certainly. But see, remember, Kashmir Shaivism is Tantra. And of course, he talks about Tantra all over the place. Brahma Shakti Abhed is a Tantric teaching. Brahma Shakti Abhed is a Tantric teaching. This is not found in any of the traditional schools of Vedanta, but it's found in Tantra, Shiva Shakti, Prakasha Vimashamaya. So that's a concrete example. What about that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles? If you replace 24 with 36, you end up with Kashmir Shaivism again. And instead of Brahman, you put Shiva in there. Shiva Shakti. Yes. These are tantric because his Ishta Devata was Kali, which is tantric. He was initiated by Kenaram Bhattacharya in the Shakti mantra. He knew Tantra. Bhairavi Brahmani, his first guru, was a Vaishnava tantric. She taught him Tantra too. We don't know the details of what she taught him, but he underwent tantric practices. Of course he knew tantric philosophy. And beyond that, there's a more kind of subtle textual point that I want to make. He owned a few books, hard copies of certain books. What are some of them? Pop quiz. What are some of the books he owned that he kept on his
Gita
shelf?
was one of them.
Ashtavakra Samhita is one. What else? Very good. Bible. How do we know that? Because he had Sharat Maharaj and Shashi Maharaj, Sharadanandaji and Ramkrishnanandaji read out from the Bible passages about celibacy, the importance of being celibate in spiritual life. But there's a third book, at least a third book. This is harder. So now this is a deep dive into, I want to see how much you know of Sri Ramakrishna's bookshelf. Huh? Bhagavad Gita is a good guess. He probably did, but this is another one I'm thinking of. Anybody? No.
It was related to Tantrism, I think.
Related to?
Related to Tantric
No.
practice. No.
Well, sort of. Okay. It's a book. It's a compilation by Bipin Bihari Ghoshal called Mukti Ebong Taha Sadhan. This sounds very academic and technical. He kept it. He had a copy. And he loved to ask people to read out from it, and then he would listen very carefully. Now, what is that text? We have copies because Udbodan has republished it, and I've looked at it. It's a very interesting compilation, thematically organized. So there's a section called Ishvara, nature of God. And what it does is, it tells you from the very beginning, the compiler, Bipin Bihari Ghoshal, he says, I'm drawing from these texts. Some of them are tantric texts, Mahanirvana Tantra. And there are a bunch of classical Advaitic texts, Panchadashi. It's very diverse, actually. Different schools of Vedanta, very broad. And Sri Ramakrishna was a genius, and he also was Shrutidhar. So when he heard something, read out loud, he memorized it. He had a photographic memory. And so when he heard these things, he just internalized them. And they quote from these texts. And there's Bipin Bihari Goshal's kind of exegesis of these texts, explaining what the texts mean. And so he heard all of it. And so he was educated in Tantra in a deep way. And of course, there's so many pundits who came regularly to visit him and that he spoke to from his childhood days. And so he learned so many shlokas from Gita, Bhagavata Purana, all these things. So we say he's illiterate, this and no, but he was a great student of Indian spiritual literature, actually. And he was a genius, actually. And this is another thing we underestimate. Even as devotees, we think he was uneducated, this and that. He didn't have a formal education. That's not the same thing as not being learned. He was highly learned, actually.
And just last, related to Neo-Vedanta, and how do you connect?
Oh, I'm not even sure what the question is exactly. What do you mean?
I mean, how does Neo-Vedanta, I know that there's a pejorative kind of connotation with that, but how does Neo-Vedanta, some of the scholars have said that Vivekananda was a Neo-Vedanta, basically newer form of Advaita Vedanta. So how does that differ from Vijnana Vedanta or integral Vedanta, of Advaita?
Right. Okay. I think the question is not as clear as it could be. But so see, what I argue at the end of chapter 1 of Infinite Paths is that I don't think it's helpful, and I think it's positively harmful in certain respects, to characterize Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta philosophy as a Neo-Vedanta. And I give a few reasons. One of them is that it makes it seem as if his philosophy is somehow radically new or newfangled. And the reason why I think that's misleading and possibly wrong is because he never claims that he's teaching something radically new. In fact, he's always eager to anchor his teachings on Vijnana, for instance. In one place in the gospel, he says he's describing Vijnana and that everything is God. And then he says, haven't you read the Gita and the Bhagavata? and the Adhyatma Ramayana, he always gives scriptural sources. Sometimes he mentions Upanishads. So that's part of the reason why I think it's problematic to say neo, because it implies a novelty that I don't think he himself would have claimed. In fact, what Swamiji understood, and which many of us miss, is that Swamiji says, it's not that we're saying anything radically new. What we're doing is we're shedding new light on the ancient Vedantic scriptures. How? By viewing them and reinterpreting them in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. So it's firmly grounded in the ancient scriptures. Okay, that's one aspect of it. The second aspect, or part of my answer to the question, is actually more technical. And that has to do with the kind of provenance of the term Neo-Vedanta. Do you know who first used the term?
I was one of the Western scholars, I don't remember.
Well, sort of. 19th century Christian missionaries in India. Okay, there are interesting essays on this by Brian Hatcher, who's a scholar at Tufts University. And so why? Why do they call, or Neo-Advaita, Neo-Vedanta? Their aim was to convert heathen Hindus to Christianity. What was their strategy? It's very interesting. This goes back to like the 15th century. I discussed this in my introduction to the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta. There was a Jesuit, a Catholic Jesuit father named Père Pons, a French Jesuit, P-O-N-S. And he writes this letter where he describes Hinduism. What does he say? He says, Hindus believe in the Luciferian doctrine. Lucifer means Satan. The satanic doctrine that they are God. They are one with God. That's a complete blasphemy from a Christian standpoint. And because of that, they engage in all sorts of unethical behavior and they think that they're God. Oh my goodness. So what are they doing there? Notice the strategic conflation that these Christian missionaries make between Hinduism. Hinduism equals Vedanta, which equals classical Advaita Vedanta. Because classical, and then it's also a kind of misinterpretation of classical Advaita Vedanta, because the classical Advaita Vedanta doesn't say that I am the personal God. He said only in one sense, in the sense that if you subtract the personal godness from the personal God, and you subtract my Medhanandatva from Swami Medhananda, what's left is Nirguna Brahman. The substratum of me and the personal God is Brahman. Okay, so that's a kind of quibble. But the point is, the strategy that many Christian missionaries in India adopted to convert Hindus to Christianity was to point out the deficiencies in Hinduism. And they did that by labeling Hinduism as Neo-Vedanta and saying that it's this kind of crazy, heretical, newfangled doctrine, which has no room for personal God and therefore eliminates the possibility of ethical behavior. And so that's why Hinduism promotes immoral behavior, and therefore everybody should be Christian. So that was a kind of original, and I'm, there are details in these scholarly discussions. But now, fast forward a little bit further. 20th century, there's a prominent German scholar named Paul Hacker, H-A-C-K-E-R. He then popularizes the label Neo-Vedanta and uses it to refer to Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta, Radhakrishnan's Vedanta. Sri Aurobindo is a more complicated case. Okay, but why? He's also Catholic, not a coincidence. Okay, and even though he was genuinely a great scholar, but he had his biases. And what he says is, and he uses these terms, he says that the Neo-Vedanta of Vivekananda and others, Radhakrishnan, is inauthentic. It's a deviation from the ancient tradition of Vedanta. And he uses these value terms. It's value-laden language. There's a kind of critical thrust behind it. And so that's the other reason why I object to the language. Because we should be using kind of neutral language when we talk about characterize the philosophy. And I think that because of the kind of Catholic Christian missionary provenance of the term, I think it's kind of infected in a way that makes the term hopeless. Now, another aspect to the issue, though, to the question, is that there are friends of Vivekananda in our tradition. There are monks in our order who have referred to Swamiji's views as Neo-Vedanta, like Tapasenandaji. But that's because he doesn't know about the Christian missionary kind of background. He's not using it in a nasty sense, obviously. But I think if you know the history of the term and all the baggage that comes associated with it, I think it's better to avoid the term.
I remember reading some of the things that you just mentioned in the book. But the question is not forget about the pejorative aspect or missionary aspect of denigrating Hinduism. But having said that, in what way Neo-Vedanta is different from.
Yeah, but it just depends on what you mean by Neo-Vedanta. There isn't just one Neo-Vedanta. There are a million modern Vedantins. Do you think Radhakrishna's Vedanta is the same as Swamiji's or the same as Sri Aurobindo's? No, absolutely not. Each so-called Neo-Vedantin has a different Vedantic view. And part of my scholarly work is about kind of emphasizing and pointing out some of the differences and the uniqueness of Radhakrishna's Vedanta. I have an article on Radhakrishna's doctrine of Sarva Mukti. It's very interesting and original. He thinks that nobody will get ultimate liberation until everybody does. Even Swamiji doesn't go that far. So these are interesting differences. So you can't generalize about Neo-Vedanta as such. That's another reason why I object to the term Neo-Vedanta, because it is monolithic. It's like one umbrella under which you lump together Sri Aurobindo and Vivekananda and how many other 100 Neo-Vedantins. But that's misleading, and it falsifies the phenomena. It fails to honor the specificity of the different Vedantic thinkers' views.
I have a question.
Yes.
Maharaj, pardon me, I am violating my own guidelines.
Uh-oh. Okay. Yeah, because it's 6:07 already, so you'd be the first to pounce on people going over the time limit. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned before in gospel, we have some contradicting statements.
Apparently, let's say apparently
yeah,
contradictory statement.
Yeah, it all depends on the context and the participants in that satsang.
Yes.
For
Correct.
So, just for my understanding, please explain to me which is the context in this type of a statement comes from Thakur. Sri Ramakrishna says, Mother, do not give me knowledge of Brahman.
Yeah.
I don't want it. Give it to those who want it.
Yeah.
What it looks contradictory statement in the
Contradictory with what?
Yeah.
Contradicting what?
That is, he's always saying he had Nirukalpa Samadhi, then Totapuri came, taught him, and all those things. Advaita, he went through those sadhanas in greater detail for 6 months of Nirukalpa Samadhi. And with that background, sometimes he will even remove all the pictures of gods and goddesses from his room and stack them up, and he has that Advaita atmosphere. So when he has those experiences, he has the knowledge of Brahman. Why does he say, Mother, don't give me the knowledge of Brahman, I don't want it, give it to those who want it. And there should be some context in it, because Swami Triyananda later on even said, I think it comes in Sri Ramakrishna as he saw him, Triyananda said, what could be better than Brahman? After hearing the statement from Thakur, he says, what could be better than Brahman? So it can be in some context, some parts of it. I don't know that.
So I think there's a simple answer. In one sentence, 3 words, Gyan pore Vigyan in Bangla. After Jnana comes Vijnana. And he even says somewhere else in the gospel, Divine Mother has kept me in the state of a Vijnani, a Bhakta. That's why he prefers. He wants to commune with Divine Mother and talk to her lovingly and talk to her devotees and see everything as God. How can he do that if he has Brahma Gyan? Everything depends on what you mean by Brahman. But the thing is, when he uses Brahman, sometimes he means Brahma Shakti. When he says, Vijnani dekhe Brahma Chatubingshi Tattva hoichan, the Vijnani sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. What he means is Brahman as Shakti. Because always remember, Brahman is inseparable from Shakti. He says it himself, Brahma Shakti Abhed. In that sense. But when he says to Divine Mother, I don't want Brahma Jnana, here he means Nirguna Brahman, which means the salt doll melting into the ocean. Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Because if he's in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he can't eat sugar anymore, but he loves to eat sugar. It's because he's a lover of sugar. He loves to eat sugar. Sugar meaning Divine Mother. And he loved to see this world as a manifestation of God. How can he do that if he's in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi and he has no external consciousness? So that's the context.
That's it. Mood dependent context.
Yeah, but his primary mood was the Vijnanis, not the Gyanis. That's very clear. You talked about his Totapuri, the sadhana and the Totapuri. That was such a fleeting time. How long did that last? Yes, he removed the pictures for a brief period when he was doing the Advaita sadhana. Then he put them back with a vengeance. And for the vast majority of his life, he was a bhakta more than a Gyani. I think that's uncontroversial. Look at the gospel. Look at the keynote of the gospel. Nothing but bhakti. And the few times he brings up Advaita, he usually cautions people away from it. He even corrects his beloved Nalin, who quotes from this Nirvana Shatkam. Chidananda Rupam Shivoham Shivoham. Naham tu. Don't say Shivoham. Say Naham tu. Not I, but thou, O Lord. He's even correcting Naren, who is a genuine adhikari for Advaita Vedanta, saying, don't say that. It's better to think of yourself as a servant, as nothing compared to God, of the personal God. So he really was not, he did not encourage people to practice Advaita Vedanta. A million times in the gospel, he says, who's fit to practice classical Advaita Vedanta? Those who, when they're in tremendous agony, when there's blood gushing out of their wound, they can still say in that moment, oh, I don't feel any pain. That's just the body. Who among us can say that? He says that person alone, who is free from body consciousness alone, is eligible to practice classical Advaita Vedanta. Other than that, we should practice bhakti. Kolite Naradiya Bhakti. In this Kali Yuga, we should practice Naradiya Bhakti. Take the Lord's name, practice devotion, engage in prayer. That's what he recommended for 99.9% of human beings on this earth, as far as I understand Sri Ramakrishna.
Excellent, Maharaj.
Thank you so much. And we're already over time, and I have to drive to Houston.
Okay, so
And
shall we end the program?
Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Jai Shri Guru Maharaj Ji ki Jai. Jai Mahamai ki Jai. Jai Swami Ji Maharaj Ji ki Jai. Thank you, everyone.